You've heard the legends of medieval swords, castles, and plagues, but do you know what truly decided who survived and who didn't in the Middle Ages? Not armor, not gold, fabric, a single cloth, hidden beneath clothing, wrapped around bodies, laid upon tables, and packed into wounds, quietly ruled every medieval household. Kings demanded it. Peasants went into debt for it. Priests considered it holy. And without it, your life would be shorter, smellier, and far more dangerous tonight. We're not talking about battles or kings. We're talking about linen, the most boring fabric in history that secretly held civilization together. So tuck yourself in, preferably under clean sheets, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval people would trade livestock, labor, and even freedom just for one piece of it. Chapter 1. From Seed to Thread, How Flax Became the Backbone of Medieval Survival, beginning now. This section will explore how linen was produced from raw plant to finished fabric, not as luxury, but as necessity if you were born in medieval Europe. Long before industrial mills and fast fashion, your life would begin and in linen. You would be swaddled in it as an infant, your diapers wrapped from it, your bed filled with it, your meals served atop it, your wounds bound in it, and at last, when your lungs drew their final breath, your body would be laid in a linen shroud, because even in death, wool was forbidden for burial in many regions. Wool was for daily labor. Linen was for the soul. But before linen became any of those things, it had to begin somewhere else entirely, as a plant. A stalk no thicker than your finger, growing in quiet rows across fields from Ireland to Poland, France to Scandinavia. You might not have noticed it passing by, pale blue flowers trembling in the breeze, but every household knew its value intimately. This plant was flax, not glamorous, not fragrant, not even especially beautiful. Yet it was as essential to medieval society as electricity is to yours. And unlike sheep, which wandered and bleated, or cotton, which would not arrive in Europe in great quantity until later centuries, flax stood still and silent, waiting for human hands to turn it into something greater. The process of creating linen was not a simple one. It was not fast. It was not easy. But it was inescapable, because medieval households did not choose linen for fashion. They relied on it for survival, the flax fields, where work began before sunrise. Imagine now that you are a medieval peasant, perhaps in Flanders, or Normandy, or the Low Countries, where the climate was mild and damp enough to grow strong fiber. The soil had to be rich, but not too rich, or the stalks would grow too thick and coarse. Landowners learned through centuries of trial that flax must be planted carefully, broadcast by hand, sometimes mixed with sand to ensure even scattering. You would walk the furrows at dawn, swinging your arm in long arcs, casting seed like rain. If you were careless and threw too many in one spot, the plants would grow tangled. Too few, and they would grow too thick-stalked. Every motion mattered. The field had to be weeded by hand, because any competing plants would ruin the fiber. No horses could trample through. No plows would pass again. Flax was a one-shot crop, grown in silence until late summer. When the flowers wilted and the stalks began to yellow, then came the harvest, not with scythes, not with blades, but with fingers. Flax was not cut. It was pulled, root and all, to preserve every inch of usable length, so entire families, men, women, and children, would bend in long rows, grasping handfuls of flax and ripping it from the earth. Your hands would blister. Your back would burn. But this was only the beginning. The bundles were tied and set to dry upright, like golden brooms leaning against one another. Within days, you could smell the change, the scent of earth, grass, and slow decay mixing in the air. Only then could the true work begin, retting, the controlled rotting of civilization. To free the fiber from the stalk, the plant had to rot. Not too much, not too little. Just enough. This process, called retting, required either still ponds, running rivers, or dewy fields, depending on local custom. Each method had its pros and cons, and entire villages were known by their preferred technique. Pond retting was fast but made the linen smell foul. River retting was slow but more consistent. Field retting, scattering the flax and letting rain and dew work their magic, was gentler but unreliable in dry years. You might carry armfuls of flax to a small pond, weighted down with stones. The water would turn murky and sour, and the air around it would grow thick with the stench of fermentation. Neighbors might complain, but they'd do the same next week. This was the price of fabric every day. Someone would test the stalks, pulling fibers apart between their thumbs. If they slipped free cleanly, the flax was ready. If not, it stayed submerged. Too long, and it turned to mush. Too short, and the fibers remained trapped. Timing was everything. This was not the work of wealthy nobles. This was the work of peasants, housewives, and hired laborers. Waking up before dawn to stir rotting plants in stagnant water. If you ever wear linen today and marvel at its cool softness, remember the smell that once gave it life. Breaking, snapping the bones of industry, once dried again. The retted flax resembled bundles of straw, stiff and brittle. Now came the breaking, an appropriately harsh name. The tool was simple, a wooden device like a hinged jaw. You would lay the flax across and slam the top down repeatedly, crushing the woody core inside. The sound echoed like dry firewood splitting. Bits of stalk would fly everywhere. Dust would fill your lungs. You might spend hours hunched over, rhythmically lifting and slamming until your shoulders throbbed. Even in portraits of noble women spinning flax, smiling daintily beside their wheels, this harsh step is never shown, because no one looked elegant while breaking flax. But without it, no thread could ever be spun. Scutching and heckling, the longest combing in history. Now came the scutching. Scraping away the broken wooden bits using a dull wooden blade. Dragging it along the fibers like a butter knife cleaning a mixing bowl. Then, finally, heckling, perhaps the most painstaking step of all. Imagine standing before a wooden board, filled with rows of iron spikes like an upright bed of nails. You take long strands of flax and drag them through again and again. First through coarse combs, then through finer ones. With each pass, the flax becomes smoother, silkier, until it resembles strands of pale gold hair. But make no mistake, this was dangerous work. A slip of the wrist could impale your hand, and medieval hospitals, if any were nearby, did not offer antibiotics, so you bled. You bandaged, and then you returned to scraping, spinning, turning labor into thread. Only once all of this was done could the spinning wheel come into play. Or before that, the simpler drop spindle, a stick weighted with stone or clay. Picture a woman sitting by the fire at night, her family asleep around her. With one hand, she feeds the flax into the spindle. With the other, she gives it a practiced twist. Slowly, silently, labor becomes thread. The spindle drops, spinning like a top. The fibers stretch. If she pulls too quickly, it snaps. Too slowly, it thickens. Her hands know the balance better than her mind does. Thread after thread fills the spindle. Bobbin after bobbin fills the basket. And still, it is not enough because a single shirt, even the most basic, sleeveless shift, took thousands of feet of thread. You would spin all winter long for a single sheet. And if you were poor, you might never own more than two. Weaving, the final act of patience. The loom stands tall, sometimes fixed to a wall, sometimes strung upright like a harp. Weaving linen on a vertical warp-weighted loom meant standing for hours, passing the shuttle from hand to hand. The sound of weaving was steady, rhythmic, and unbroken, the kind of sound that settles into the bones. Clack, pull, beat, repeat. Days passed, threads became cloth. Cloth became life, and now, a question. Before we move on to how linen shaped food, medicine, currency, law, and war in everyday medieval existence, consider this. After all of that, the pulling, rotting, breaking, scraping, spinning, weaving. How valuable would a single square of linen be to you? Would you scrub floors with it? Would you throw it away when torn? Would you let your children play with it? Or would you fold it carefully, patch it again and again, pass it down when you died? Because that is what they did. Chapter 2. Linen in Daily Life, from Cradle to Grave. From Kitchen to Battlefield, if Section 1 was about effort. Section 2 is about purpose. Now that you understand how many months of labor it took to create even a small piece of linen, you can finally appreciate how precious it was to medieval households, not as fashion, but as function. Linen was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. It wrapped babies, lined armor, filtered food, protected books, bound wounds, and even served as currency. Linen was so essential, so omnipresent, that medieval life without it would have been nearly impossible. And so, let us now walk slowly through the daily routines of a typical household and observe how linen quietly held every detail together. Morning, waking in linen, breathing through it. Your day begins long before sunrise, because medieval homes did not have insulation. And the cold creeps in before dawn. Most people slept fully clothed, wrapped in linen undergarments and linen sheets, sometimes layered beneath heavy woolen blankets. Linen was worn closest to the skin, not because it was soft, but because it was washable. Wool could not be washed easily. Cotton was rare. But linen, even though it took months to produce, was practical. It wicked away sweat. It absorbed oils. It could withstand boiling water and harsh soap. It was scrubbed, beaten, bleached, sun-dried, and reused until it nearly dissolved. Even the wealthiest nobles, sleeping beneath embroidered bed canopies, still rested on simple white linen sheets. Kings may have worn silk, but they slept on linen, because sweat is universal. Dressing for the day, layers of function when you rise. The first garment to go on is your linen shift, the medieval equivalent of underwear. If you are a man, it is called a shirt, long, loose, and knee-length. If you are a woman, it is a chemise, often ankle-length, but regardless of gender. This layer was never seen in polite company. It was invisible beneath wool or leather garments. Yet it was the most important article of clothing you owned. You likely owned only 1 or 2 shifts, and they were washed as often as water, time, and weather allowed. Often not daily, but weekly. Linen rubbed against your skin every moment of the day. It prevented outer garments from becoming stained. It provided a barrier against itchy wool and chafing armor. Even knights wore linen padding beneath their mail and plate, or the metal would bleed them dry. So yes, even in battle, linen saved lives. In the kitchen, cloth as tool, not decoration. Breakfast was not eaten at a set table. It was assembled slowly, starting with bread, porridge, or leftover stew, depending on your class. But linen was already working before you even took a bite. Bread was often proofed beneath linen cloths, keeping insects away while allowing air to pass through. Cheese was wrapped in linen to absorb moisture while aging. Milk was filtered through linen bags, straining out curds or debris. Even salt, a rare and expensive commodity, was stored and dried in linen bags to prevent clumping. There were no paper towels, no plastic wrap, no metal strainers. There was linen. And if a cloth became too stained to use in food preparation, it did not go to waste. It was rerouted to cleaning duty. It would be used to wipe tables, dry hands, polish utensils. Only when it could no longer serve any kitchen purpose at all would it be cut into scraps and placed near the hearth. To be used as tinder in a medieval home, nothing dyed cleanly. Every object degraded through stages. Linen was born as cloth, lived as rag, and died as flame. At the market, Linen as currency, you might think of money today as metal or paper. But for much of medieval Europe, cloth was wealth. In Flanders, England, and northern France, woven linen and wool were used as payment. A bolt of cloth might be worth a cow or even a small field. Land deeds sometimes listed rents owed in linen lengths. 4 ells of good flax linen yearly, 1 linen sheet each harvest. Even dowries were paid in linen chests if you were a bride. You brought not only yourself to your new home, but armfuls of woven proof that you were industrious, that you could clothe a household, dress babies, keep a bed fit for sleeping. And so, a woman without linen was considered unfit for marriage, not because of beauty, not because of charm, but because she could not sustain life. Linen and law, when cloth protected lives, linen was such a universal necessity that laws formed around it in some regions. Sumptuary laws, regulations dictating what one could wear, specified how much linen a person of each class could purchase or display. This was not to suppress comfort, but to prevent improper displays of status, because linen, unlike silk or jewels, did not glitter. It did not announce itself. It whispered of competence, of quiet wealth, and that was dangerous. A merchant wearing fine bleached linen might pass for a noble. A peasant dressed in brightly dyed linen trim might appear prosperous. And so rulers tried, often in vain, to keep linen humble. But they could not stop it from spreading, because linen was not a luxury to be controlled. It was a survival tool, and no law can forbid survival. Sickness, wounds, and linen as medicine. There were no sterile gauze pads or medical bandages in the medieval world. There was linen, old linen, washed until soft and thin, was stored in bundles near the hearth for medical emergencies. If a child fell, linen bound the wound. If a woman gave birth, linen swaddled the infant and absorbed the blood if someone became feverish. Linen sheets were soaked in vinegar or herbs and laid across their forehead or chest. Every home was a hospital by necessity, and every housewife a nurse. Some physicians even insisted that linen cloth must be used for all bandages. Not wool, because wool held dirt and irritated wounds. Monasteries producing medical treatises specified thread count instructions, fine linen for burns, coarse linen for fractures. You could survive without metal. You could survive without shoes. But you could not survive without cloth. In war, linen beneath steel. Even the image of a knight, gleaming armor, shining sword, hides linen beneath every layer before donning mail. A knight would wear a padded linen gambeson, a thick coat stuffed with linen scraps or tow. The short fibers removed during heckling. Without it, chainmail would crush bone and tear flesh. With it, the force of blows was dampened. So every clang of steel you imagine, every heroic duel, rests on the quiet labor of women breaking flax months earlier. Even arrows, when fletched, sometimes used linen thread to bind feathers. Warriors may have claimed glory, but linen bore the impact. Evening, repairs, rags, and ritual. As daylight faded, families gathered indoors. Candles were expensive, so much of the evening was spent in shadows. But hands did not rest. Linen was constantly mended, a tear in a sleeve, sewn, a hole in a sheet, patched, a tablecloth too stained, cut smaller and reused. And when even that piece failed, when the fabric became too thin to hold a thread, it entered its final life. As wick, small strips of linen were twisted into candle wicks, dipped repeatedly in tallow or beeswax until thick. And then, flicker by flicker, it returned to light. A life spent touching human skin finally fed the flame that let them see in darkness. And finally, death, in many European regions. Burial laws required the dead to be wrapped in linen shrouds, not wool. Why? Because wool was the fabric of life, warm, durable, every day. But linen was pure. It was believed to be cleaner, more appropriate for the grave. Even kings buried in gold-lined tombs were wrapped first in linen, just like the poorest peasant. From birth to death, from diaper to shroud, linen bookended existence. We have now seen how linen defined daily life, touching every human body, every household, every field of labor, visible or not. But in our final section, we must ask a harder question. If linen was so valuable, why did people not abandon it for easier materials? Why keep rotting, crushing, combing plants by hand when alternatives like hemp, wool, or imported cotton existed? Why remain so loyal to this pale, scratchy fabric? What deeper need did linen fulfill beyond mere function? Chapter 3. Why linen endured: cleanliness, symbolism, and the silent power of fabric. You now understand how linen was used in beds, in kitchens, in war, in markets, and even in burial. But there is a lingering question. If linen was so labor-intensive and so costly, why did medieval people not replace it with something easier? Why did they cling to it, generation after generation, when hemp, cotton, leather, and wool all existed as textile alternatives? The answer is more than practical. It is cultural, spiritual, and deeply symbolic. Linen was not just cloth. It was purity, order, decency, and identity. Linen as cleanliness, long before germ theory, long before people understood bacteria. They understood smell. Wool could be washed, but it took forever to dry and retained odors. Leather absorbed sweat and became sour. Hemp was durable but stiff, but linen, when laundered, smelled fresh, neutral, even pleasant in sunlight. It could be boiled without losing shape. It could be bleached on grass, laid flat under open skies until whitened by dew and sun. And so linen became the fabric of cleanliness. Monastic orders, obsessed with discipline, required linen for bedding and undergarments. Medieval monks kept strict laundering schedules, believing that clean linen encouraged moral behavior. While filth bred temptation, even in peasant homes, a clean shift day was observed with a kind of quiet reverence. You may not have bathed fully, but changing into fresh linen counted as renewal. In the absence of modern hygiene, linen was ritual cleanliness. Linen as modesty, a barrier between body and world. To be without linen was not merely uncomfortable, it was shameful. To be seen in just your shift, your linen underlayer, was considered borderline indecent. Medieval writings described such moments with embarrassment, almost equal to being seen unclothed. This is why knights were often described in romances as stripping the linen before a duel, not fully naked, but vulnerable enough to show their inner layer, symbolically laying down status. And this is also why criminals or traitors were sometimes paraded without linen, forced into coarse garments as humiliation. To strip someone of linen was to strip them of dignity. It wasn't the thickness of the fabric that mattered. It was the boundary it represented between body and society, between private and public, between animal and human. Linen and religion, a fabric of sacred duty. In Christian Europe, linen held holy significance. Priests wore linen albs beneath their robes, not for appearance, but for purity. Church altars were covered in bleached linen cloths, washed and prepared with strict care. And during services, linen cloths held the Eucharist. Folded and laid like sacred cradles, there was a belief, never officially declared, yet widely followed, that God preferred linen to touch holy objects, even in Islamic regions. Linen had similar status, worn beneath garments for ritual cleanliness, ensuring purity before prayer. The Egyptian tradition of wrapping mummies in linen was still remembered in medieval culture. It reinforced a timeless belief. Linen was the fabric of passage between life and death, between mortal world and divine. Linen as inheritance passed through generations. When a child was born, they were swaddled in linen bands. When they grew into adults, their first personal garment was a linen shirt or shift, often made by their mother, as they left home to marry or serve. They carried bundles of folded linen, proof that they came from order, not chaos. And when parents aged, They passed on their linens, not jewelry, not tools, but sheets, towels, tablecloths, and head coverings. Some household linens lasted 50 years or more, patched dozens of times, turned multiple colors from sun and soap. A noblewoman's will from 14th century England lists, "To my daughter Agnes, 2 of my best linen sheets, 1 tablecloth, and my father's napkin, which has been in our house 60 years. A piece of fabric could outlive 3 human generations." And so, every stain was a memory. Linen versus cotton, the late arrival of competition. You might ask, but what about cotton? Cotton was used in medieval times, but rarely in Europe before the 13th century. And even then, only among the wealthy. Imported cotton from India or the Arab world was light, soft, luxurious. But it was also expensive, and European weavers did not yet know how to spin it finely. Early medieval cotton fabric in Europe was often coarse, used more for padding than for garments. Some armor was padded with bombast, cotton or wool stuffing. Cotton was inside armor, not worn upon the skin. Cotton never replaced linen in daily life. Only when colonial trade exploded in the 17th-18th centuries, long after the medieval period, did cotton begin to dominate. For medieval households, cotton was an exotic treat. Linen was infrastructure. Linen versus wool. Warmth versus cleanliness. Wool kept you warm. Linen kept you clean. Wool could be dyed into deep reds and blues. Linen took light yellows, pale blues, and white. Wool felt rich. Linen felt pure. No one in the Middle Ages would ever consider choosing between them. They were 2 halves of survival. To wear wool without linen would be itchy, damp and foul. To wear linen without wool would be cold. Fragile and unprotected, you needed both. And so every medieval wardrobe, from peasant to emperor, relied on an unspoken hierarchy of fiber, linen beneath, wool above, leather outside, body, warmth, shield, linen as identity. Cultural differences across Europe. Not all linen looked the same. In Flanders, linen was fine and white, often bleached to near glow on vast grassy bleaching fields. In Ireland, linen, later known as Irish linen, was coarser but durable, preferred for sacks and ropes. In Italy, linen was sometimes mixed with silk, creating linsey-woolsey fabrics, or fustian, linen warp with cotton weft, blending practicality with flourish. Even the texture of your linen could betray your origin. Traveling merchants could often identify someone not by accent, but by the weight and fiber of their sleeves. Linen was regional dialect, not of language, but of touch. The slow death of linen, or did it die at all? The dominance of linen did not end quickly, even in the 19th century. Many European households still considered linen the proper choice for sheets, tablecloths, and undergarments. Only when industrial cotton became cheap, soft, and universally available did linen begin to fade from daily life. And yet, linen never vanished. To this day, doctors still use linen like gauze for bandages. Monks still wear linen albs. Linen tablecloths remain symbols of dignity in formal dining. Fine European suits are still lined in linen. We like to think we have moved beyond medieval habits. But perhaps linen still lingers, not out of nostalgia, but because it was always the right material for the most human tasks. Final reflection, a fabric that held civilization together. So now we return to our question, why did linen endure? It was not softest, it was not easiest, it was not even most affordable, but it was trustworthy. Wool could itch, leather could crack, hemp could fray, cotton could fail in cold, but linen, when washed, dried, and used correctly, could last decades, absorbing life without complaint. It was invisible yet indispensable, uncelebrated yet fundamental. And perhaps that is why linen deserves remembering. Because history is not only built by kings and warriors, but by fabric quietly enduring against skin. Day after day, holding together the fragile boundary between comfort and misery. Linen was not fashion, it was survival. And now, you know why every medieval household paid a fortune to keep it close. If you made it this far, you're either asleep already, or you're one of the rare few who truly appreciate the quiet side of history. Either way, thank you for spending your night here with me at Quiet Boring Sleep. If this gentle journey through linen, laundry, and medieval life helped you relax, please consider liking this video. It lets me know to make more stories just like this. And if you'd like to fall asleep to more uneventful yet oddly comforting history, subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. And I'll be here waiting the next time your mind refuses to rest. Sleep well. And may your sheets, linen or not, be soft tonight.